Everybody. My name is Sarah Ryan from Sylvania Northview High School, and today from Psychology in My Kitchen. I'm sorry, I just heard my dog grump in the background. He's a dachshund, they're allowed to do that. So in today's episode, we are looking at Unit 2 in AP Psychology, and that is research methods. So this is going to be kind of a big unit in that a lot of what it is that we study throughout the year comes back to this unit of research methods. And we're going to have a couple of different videos regarding research methods. And today we're going to be looking at some of the most common ones that psychologists are going to use in their everyday lives, I suppose. So when we talk about research methods, we know that in psychology, our definition of psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental process. And we already established that it is a scientific study because it's going to utilize scientific methodology, which of course, for many of us, we think of scientific method and we think of experimentation, which psychologists do use on a regular basis. But there's going to be situations in which I'm still curious about human behavior and the way people think and feel and remember and all of that, but I don't necessarily have the ability to conduct a full-blown experiment for a bunch of different reasons. So there are other ways that I can still go about studying psychology that might not be as good as doing an experiment, but they're still going to be able to give me insights into human behavior. And so today we're looking at what some of those different research methodologies would be that I might use to study human behavior. So first of all, one of the most commonly used types of research methods that we have in psychology is something known as naturalistic observation, which is, as you can imagine, observing an organism, in this case a human being, in their natural habitat. But there's a couple of key features to identify about naturalistic observation. One, it's probably one of the easiest research methods to do, especially if you're utilizing organisms that are in public spaces. When we are out in public, we kind of release some of those freedoms and protections to privacy that we enjoy when we are in our own private spaces. When we are out in public, anybody can see us and anybody can potentially record what it is that we are doing out in public. And so that's a piece about public places. So when people are out in public, we can just watch their behavior and see the things that they do. And this can lead us to asking more specific questions about human behavior and why is it that humans are going to do what they do. So in some ways, naturalistic observation is kind of this easier way to go about looking at people because that's all that I'm doing. I'm not manipulating any kind of variables or anything like that. I'm simply observing behavior and I'm likely recording that behavior in some way. Now, when I say record, a lot of people think that that might be like with a camera or with my phone or something like that. But really, recording might just be in my own notes, like I'm taking notes as to how many times someone is going to demonstrate a particular behavior. And that would still be considered a naturalistic observation. It's naturalistic because I'm not manipulating anything. I haven't done anything in order to try to change this person's behavior. I'm simply observing what it is that they're doing in any given situation. So this is really something that's ultimately going to help lead me to a hypothesis that I might utilize in an experiment. So I can give you an example. Now, given the state of the world right now, as we are in an international pandemic, one of the pieces of human behavior that has significantly been influenced as a way to change is mask wearing behavior. And you might have a mask in your own home. You might have different kinds of masks that you wear. And given whatever state that you live in, I live in the state of Ohio. Currently, we are under a state mandate where every person out in public is required to wear a mask. And that's going to vary from location to location. So let's say that I lived in a space where There was no mask requirement, that this was something that was a personal choice, and that people, when they go out in public, they could either choose to wear a mask or not wear a mask. What psychologists actually have started to observe in these situations in which Americans, I should specify, because this is different culturally from place to place, but that Americans, in that masks are not a commonplace occurrence, they're not something that most Americans were wearing pre-pandemic. If they, had a cold or something like that, we just used to breathe all over each other. That something we're starting to observe is that when humans have a choice, women are much more likely to wear masks than men. And we come to initially this kind of, that's interesting, by doing naturalistic observation. So for you, if you, well, really shouldn't be spending a whole lot of time in public, let's be honest. But if you find yourself like at a grocery store and your grocery store doesn't have any kind of mask requirement, and you tend to notice who is wearing a mask and who is not, um, that would be a naturalistic observation. You are observing people as they're going about their daily lives, doing the things that they want to do, looking at a particular behavior. And so if I see anecdotally, it seems like a whole lot more women are wearing masks than men, and then maybe I keep a little tally of all the people that I encounter when I'm in the grocery store, I'm conducting naturalistic observation. I can't draw any conclusions on this. Okay, it's not going to give me a definitive, like, well, guess what? Men don't wear masks. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. But it's going to help lead me into maybe doing further research as to, well, is this something that happens, commonly, that men are less likely to wear masks? And then starting to explore the reasons, why is it perhaps that men are less likely to wear masks, or that women are more likely to wear masks? That's what naturalistic observation gives us. It kind of leads us into further questions about human behavior. Now, another type of research method that we use very frequently in psychological research is something known as a case study. So in a case study, I am going to study a single person or a small group of people in depth in hopes of finding out something that could be applied to all human behavior. So the thing about a case study is that case studies allow me an opportunity to study a phenomenon that I wouldn't necessarily be able to see under normal circumstances. It's for something that is unusual or something that I couldn't replicate in an experiment. And I'm going to talk about this very famous case study in just a second of Phineas Gage. So if you were to take something like child abuse, unfortunately, we know it's something that occurs, that children are abused by their parents or other types of caregivers. But I can't go and replicate that in some type of experiment. There are so many ethical things that just I couldn't do in that circumstance, right? Parents aren't going to say, oh, here, you can beat my child and we'll see what happens later. Like, no one's going to do something like that. But because we know that some children are abused and that there can be profound behavioral effects on that, the only way that I'm going to be able to study that kind of phenomenon is to find humans who were abused and observe and study what happens because of it. So that would be considered a case study. So I'm studying a single person in depth, or a small group of people who all have experienced some sort of phenomenon that is unique and that I couldn't replicate. Now, there are some real positives to this type of research method, but there's some drawbacks too. So for one thing, we get to study something pretty darn in depth. Okay, I can gain a deep understanding of something that occurs when I use a case study. However, and the other thing, of course, is that I'm studying something I wouldn't necessarily see otherwise. However, there are some big drawbacks to a case study. One of them, of course, is that I'm utilizing a small sample, right? If I have this revolutionary case study that's about just a single person, but I'm saying that this is what happens to all people, well, that's not necessarily true. So even though human beings are very, 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 very similar to each other, there's always going to be exceptions. And that if I have only studied a single person, I'm not going to know if they're the exception or the rule. And so that's going to be a big problem with case studies, is that I'm trying to like stretch these truths over all of these people when really this is just what I saw in this one person or in this small group of people. I could make an assumption, but we know what assuming does, right? So that's going to be kind of a problem. Another problem with case studies, and this is going to plague a lot of psychological research, is our tendency for different types of human bias. So we know that when people engage in psychological research and they know that they are part of research, that can influence their behavior. A lot of times humans like to be good little subjects. If they know that they're being studied and they want to be helpful, that they might change their behavior to meet what they think are the expectations of the researcher. And that, of course, can lead to different behavioral outcomes. The other bias can happen is, of course, on the part of the researcher. They found this really kind of neat thing that happened, and they want to study it and they want to find something really revolutionary. That can actually cloud their judgment as to what it is that they observe in this other person. So, again, leading to another type of biased outcome. Another thing about case studies is that they tend to take a really long time to conduct. You're studying a person or a small group of people generally for years at a time. And so because it takes so long, it's also going to cost a lot of money to do that kind of research. And sometimes that's just not something that's totally feasible. So I want to talk about one of our most famous case studies in psychology, and that is the story of Mr. Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage is depicted in my pictures below, and Phineas was a railroad worker in the late 1800s in the United States. He is working on railroad construction, and part of his work is taking what's known as a railroad tie. A railroad tie is like a long metal spike that is going to be drilled into the ground. It's actually what helps hold the railroad to the earth. Okay, so what you really need to have with these rails. And at this time, as you can imagine, workmen's safety isn't always, real top notch there. And they're utilizing different types of explosives. So during one day of work, he's working on the railroad all the livelong day. And Phineas Gage is going to be in a railroad accident in which he is pounding a railroad tie into the earth. He hits some type of explosive. As he hits the explosive, the railroad tie that was in front of him is going to shoot up out of the earth. And it's going to hit him just below the cheekbone, like right about here. So the railroad tie enters his cheekbone, but because there is such force behind this tie, the metal rod is going to then shoot out the top of his head. So it entered underneath this cheek, shoots out the top of the head. Okay, imagine like a super long bullet. Okay, is what has gone through Phineas Gage's head. Here's where things get really interesting. So Phineas Gage, as you can imagine, kind of knocked off his feet by this, but he's still conscious. He is still awake. He is still alive. And so he goes to his manager. He signs out for the day to make sure he gets paid, and he gets taken to a local doctor. The local doctor puts his skull cap back on and stitch, and Phineas survives. Okay, he has this horrible head injury, but he survived it. But even though he survived, there were some pretty distinct differences that started happening to Phineas and his behavior afterwards. Prior to this railroad accident, he was a pretty stand-up guy. He attended church regularly. He was a hard worker. Okay, he's just kind of a standard normal dude. But afterwards, he becomes just like this real mean, crotchety, alcoholic kind of dude who he um, he can't really control a lot of his impulsive behavior, and he acts really angry all the time. Which I mean, he had a railroad tie go through his head. That's going to ruin someone's day, right? But it's as if his personality has distinctly changed, and in fact, it had. And so the Phineas Gage case study is actually one of our first case studies in psychology that allows us to begin mapping out different parts of the brain and what behaviors that they are responsible for. Phineas Gage's accident actually allows us an opportunity to understand that this front part of the brain, which is known as a prefrontal cortex, that's going to be responsible for things like logic, planning, decision making, impulse control, personality. That's all going to be housed in that area of the brain. Now, we know this from further research, but our curiosity of it in psychology really gets started with Phineas Gage. So, sidebar on the case study of Phineas Gage, but this is really kind of what case studies allow us, that they're allowing us to study some sort of phenomenon that is extraordinary, like taking a steel rod to the head, okay? I wouldn't be able to study it under other circumstances. Again, not a lot of people are going to sign up for having a hole go through their noggin. But they can have some biases, okay? And they can take a long time and be expensive for us to study. So because of that, I might look to another type of research method. And this one is much easier to do. And that is the good old survey. How many of you have been part of a survey? If you just answered yes, congratulations, you just took a survey. All right, surveys are simply a means of asking somebody a series of questions. And what that allows me to do is to look at many people and their behaviors all at once. So like I could take a survey about how frequently do you wash your hands? How often do you wear a mask in public? How often are you going to stand 6 feet away from another human being? Those are all examples of survey questions, okay? Now, surveys can have some good things, but they also have some bad things too. So one good thing, of course, is that they're easy to do and they're fast, and that makes them cheap. So surveys are going to be a preferred method in a lot of instances for how I might be able to get some broad idea of human behavior. However, there are some big problems with surveys, and one of the ones that I think you probably know of right off the bat is that people lie. People lie all the time in surveys. Why do people lie on surveys? Well, sometimes they don't always, know the question very well. They don't read it very well the way that it was supposed to be written or something like that. So they inadvertently lie or say something that's not true about their behavior. Maybe they're ashamed of their behavior. If I were to ask if you always wore a mask in public and you confidently say yes, but some of you might be like, well, I wear it most of the time, okay? But there are some instances in which you don't. So in that case, you might respond, yes, I always wear a mask, even though that might not be 100% true. So again, you lied. We also know that with younger people, sometimes we lie just to be funny, or we lie because we don't care. And so because we don't care about this, I'm not really concerned about giving accurate information to whomever is collecting this survey information. So all of those things can have an impact on whether or not my survey has any kind of accuracy. Of course, another way that surveys can be problematic is that they are also very much open to bias. And they're open to bias based off of things like the way in which a question is worded. And we refer to this as a wording effect. So if, for example, and we see this a lot with politics, if I were coming from a certain political standpoint and I wanted individuals to respond to my survey, and I wanted them to respond to my survey a particular way to bolster the way that I think and feel, I might word my question in a way in which a person be like, well, of course I agree with this, or how could you not agree? I mean, like something along those lines. And so the way that I have presented this topic, presented my question, can actually influence whether or not a person is going to respond a particular way. Now, it doesn't always happen, but that's a way in which bias can lead itself into my survey. The other thing is that as humans, well, one, we don't like being wrong. And because we don't like being wrong, we often overestimate how much people agree with us because we can't imagine ourselves being wrong. And so sometimes, especially when we're responding to surveys, we don't respond accurately because we think this is how everybody else feels. And so when we encounter, like, oh, other people don't think the way that I do, huh, that's so strange. Like, that is another problem that can happen with surveys. So good news about surveys is that they're cheap, they're easy to do. I can get lots of data all in a short period of time, but there's a whole lot of bias that can happen in my surveys. Even the way in which I conduct my survey is going to be really problematic, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So some other kind of research methods that are somewhat unique to psychology are research studies that are known as longitudinal or cross-sectional. We see this predominantly in our developmental psychologists, where they're studying human behavior from womb to tomb and looking at people from various age ranges. A longitudinal study or longitudinal research is when I follow a certain person or a certain group of people for an extended period of time. So it's almost like a case study plus survey plus observational research, but it's done on the same group of people as they age, because what I am studying is how they age. I'm looking at what happens to this group as they get older, as they experience more and more in their life. So, as you can imagine, one of the big problems with longitudinal studies is that they take a really long time. In fact, a lot of longitudinal studies are started by one group of psychologists and they don't get finished by that same group of psychologists because they all die. And so it gets finished by another group of psychologists. So that's going to be a little bit of a problem with longitudinal studies. But longitudinal studies give us an immensely rich pool of data to learn about people and their behavior and things like how did their education ultimately impact their life? How did something like religious beliefs, if they got married, if they had children, if they experienced any type of disease, all of those things can have an impact in my overall livelihood that if somebody's not studying me for a long period of time, I wouldn't be able to get all of that rich information. So longitudinal studies give us all kinds of pieces of data that are especially interesting to developmental psychologists in looking at kind of the long term, right? They're playing the long game here. Now, another problem with a longitudinal study is that sometimes people get signed up for longitudinal studies by their parents when they are young children, and that when they turn 18, they of course have the freedom to decide not to be part of that longitudinal study. Likewise, anybody would be able to leave a longitudinal study at any point in time if they wanted to. You have people who die early, right? Accidents, things like that. So you're going to start with a whole lot of people in your longitudinal study, and you can expect that not all of them will complete your longitudinal study, and that can potentially change the data that you have gathered in your longitudinal study. So because of all of these things, I might actually implement what's known as a cross-sectional study. So a cross-sectional study is also something that might be widely used by a developmental psychologist, but instead of studying the same group of people over a long period of time, I study people at different age brackets at the same time. So I'm going to direct your attention down to my graph. So at my graph, if you see, there's this little baby and it says 1965, okay? And this red line is indicating this is what a longitudinal study would look like. You started studying this person in 1965 when they were born. You maybe stopped studying them when they were, doing the math here, what, 25, 35, 25 in 1990? Whew, math in the morning. So you studied them for 25 years, right? So it's the same person, you studied them for 25 years. This is where they ended up. That's a longitudinal study, okay? But if you don't have the time to do something like that, instead, if you look at this line where it's like the little baby and then there's the little kid and they grow up, that sort of a thing, and it's all happening at the same period of time, that's a cross-sectional study. So instead of following the same person, you looked at people who were infants and 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds and 20-year-olds and 25, that's right there. That you're studying different people at different age brackets. This can be beneficial if you're trying to look at information and how that changes from generations and that sort of thing. But in general, the data isn't as rich because you haven't followed the same person for those 25 years or so. But it's going to save a whole lot of time, which means that it saves a whole lot of money. So that might be something that a researcher is going to look into. Now, all of this data that I have collected, so let's say, for example, that I am doing a survey or I have done an observational, a naturalistic observation, or I have done a case study, I'm going to gather information about that. I'm collecting my data. But all that data is going to be able to show me is whether or not this phenomenon, this behavior, correlates with another behavior. It's not going to be able to draw anything conclusive. It's simply demonstrating if there is perhaps a correlation between these two behaviors that occur. So for example, if I look at my graph is depicting a correlation between students and what their GPA, their grade point average is, depending on the number. We're going to assume that they're drinking alcohol here and not, milkshakes or something like that bring in the boys to the yard. Like, that's going to be our assumption with our graph here. And so it's saying that there is a correlation between the amount of alcohol that this person is consuming in a week and their GPA, identifying that the higher their GPA, the less alcoholic beverages that they are consuming in a particular week. And so this is just telling me that those things correlate. Does it mean that all these people who have really high GPAs aren't consuming any alcohol? No. There could be another variable that is involved in all of this. All I can see is that the two things correlate. So this is known as a statistical measurement, and that is a correlation, or what's known as a correlation coefficient. So these are things that you're probably familiar with from some of your math classes, and that you look at the correlation of phenomenon and how it gets graphed. And it uses a particular kind of graph known as a scatter plot. So what you do is you have your data that you have collected and you plot it on a graph. And if the plots look like this guy over here on the far right, you'll see that there's no correlation, that the plots are just all over each other, that there isn't any rhyme or reason to it. It doesn't appear that these two phenomena are going to correlate with one another. However, if we are able to calculate a correlation coefficient that is closer to a positive 1, I am seeing a positive correlation. and that in a positive correlation, as one of my variables is increasing in their frequency, my other variable is also increasing in its frequency. This can also go on the flip side, that if one of my variables is decreasing in frequency and my other variable is also decreasing in frequency, I still have a positive correlation because my variables are still moving in the same direction. And as it is plotted on the graph, you can see that it creates a line of best fit. And it looks like so. Now, a negative correlation, on the other hand, is when my correlation coefficient is most closely to -1. And in a negative correlation, as one of my variables is increasing in frequency, my other variable is decreasing in frequency. And so they are going in opposite directions. Positive correlation, they're going in the same direction. Negative correlation, they're going in opposite direction. So as this one variable has increased, the other variable has decreased, negative correlation. Now, if my correlation coefficient is closer to 0, that is telling me that there is no correlation between my two variables. And so that is what's telling me is happening with the slope of my scatter plot. So again, something that you're probably familiar with, but this is how it's actually used, right? People always ask things like, when am I going to use this? Well, correlation actually impacts psychology all the time because as we collect data on human behavior and that we want to see if there is a relationship between those two things, I might be able to identify that two behavioral phenomena, they are correlated with one another. Doesn't mean that they cause each other. That's really important that we need to identify in psychology as well as other sciences, that just because I have two variables that correlate and they appear to have a relationship with one another, there can be a third variable that actually influences both of these variables, and that is what's having an impact on these things. And so just because things correlate to one another does not mean that one causes the other. And if you look at my picture, it's talking about a faulty assumption between broken homes and crime. So there is actually a strong correlation between people who have tumultuous home lives. All right, their parents might not both be in the picture. Maybe it's different relatives. Maybe you're talking about children who grew up in the foster care system. Okay, that children who live these kinds of lives of being in a broken home, all right, there is an increased likelihood that that person might commit a crime in their future as an adult. However, just because these things correlate doesn't mean that one causes the other, because a third variable that also plays a significantly large role as to whether or not a person is going to commit crimes or live in a broken home is actually poverty. And that when people experience poverty, it puts unnecessary strain on family units, which makes them less likely to be able to survive their relationship, thus broken home. But being someone who lives in poverty also increases the likelihood of committing crime to survive. And so all of these things correlate to each other. And so just because a broken home has this strong correlation to crime doesn't necessarily mean that that is the reason why a person is going to commit a crime, and vice versa. That just because somebody has committed a crime does not necessarily mean that they will then have a broken home. So correlation does not mean causation. So in today's video, we have talked about some of the significant types of research methods that psychologists will use. In our next video, we are going to explore the ultimate research method in psychology, and that, of course, is going to be experimentation. Until next time, have a great day.